All right. Well, good to see all of you tonight. We're going back to the Stone Ages tonight, and we're using paper and whiteboards. I don't have a PowerPoint for this evening because I'm going to just do a little intermission from our study of the book Why Dispensationalism Matters. If you've been following along, we just finished up the dispensationalism teaching on Israel, page 45 through 52. And so we're now, if you've got your book, we're going to be on page 53, and that'll be when I get back. Yep. We just got some new copies in, so if anybody wants a copy, I've got some. I do have one reserved for Ingrid, who visited last week. I told her if she came tonight, I had it, but if I didn't, I would give it to Pastor Cleve. So there you go. If Ingrid gets a hold of you, you got her book. Because if I don't do it now, I'll forget. That's where we're going to be. So those of you that have jumped into our study recently, if you want to catch up in the reading over the next couple weeks during missions conference, catch up to page 52, and when I get back, we'll jump in on the church and dispensationalism on page 53. So that's where we're at in our study. But before we go into the church, I want to just kind of bring us up to speed chronologically how we're working through the dispensations. Now, with that being said, I've given you a chart. If you didn't get one, throw your hand up and one of our lovely assistants will bring you one. This is a chart from Ryrie's Dispensationalism as it's noted in 1995. That book was revised in 2001 or 2, but this chart still gives a general outline of what we would call classic dispensationalism. Many today are calling what Ryrie, Dwight Pentecost, and others advocated through the 70s and 80s, calling it a revised dispensationalism, because there are some distinguishing differences between classic, which would be Scofield and Darby, some others, versus kind of this, what you have in front of you here. I just say that to say this. One of the critiques that we will address at the end of this study against dispensationalism would be that dispensationalists can't agree on how many dispensations there are and what they are, even if we agree. And to be honest with you, I can print out about 7 charts that are 7-point dispensationalists, and they won't have the same dispensations. And within them, they won't have all of them starting and ending at the same time. Even if they use the same titles, they'll have variations of when a dispensation begins and ends. Why is that? Well, because not everything is easy to just nail down, and I'll talk through that in just a minute. So dispensationalism does not depend on any particular number of dispensations. It doesn't depend on any titles for the dispensations. And so I want you to understand that. You may pull out a chart someday that has 10 dispensations and be like, whoa, what is this? It's okay. It's nothing to panic about. Try to understand why they put those there, what they're saying, and the reason that they're putting those there. Because ultimately what dispensationalism is about is distinguishing how God has related to mankind throughout history and how He will continue to relate to mankind into the future. And so those are the distinguishing marks from, remember, the Scriptures, a literal hermeneutic. We're going to take a literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutic of the Scripture, interpret it that way, and there are going to be things then that are not easy to point and just kind of pin down. It's easier in the past than it is the future. Why would that be? Why is it easier to pin down specifics of the past than the future? Because it already happened, exactly. It's sort of like being able to identify the first and second coming of Christ. For us, we go, duh, it's right there. We read Isaiah 53 and we see this Savior, this Messiah, who is the anointed one, is going to be a lamb led to slaughter. But then you go to Isaiah 62, 63, and Messiah is going to come in triumph and defeat all the enemies. And you're like, what? Like, how is he going to be a lamb slaughtered and at the same time be triumphant and defeat all his enemies? That doesn't seem possible. But once we now can look back and say, oh, in the first coming, he came in humility as a lamb led to slaughter. In the second coming, he's coming with power and might and is going to establish a kingdom and at the sound of his voice annihilate all of his enemies. Now it makes sense because we have two different events. And so looking back, it's a little bit easier. So as we start to look ahead, some things are going to be a little more difficult, and we'll just chart through it as best as we can see the Scriptures, put down the things we know to be true, and then reconcile them to the appropriate time, where it fits into what God's doing. So, what you have here in your chart and what I want to put up here on the board today is going to be a classic revised dispensational outlook. And I think for just understanding as we bridge from Israel to the church, we're going to be talking about some things in that first lesson about the church that a lot of people just haven't thought about. They haven't been confronted with. They haven't really been put down and said, hey, we need to talk through this. We need to think about this. And we can kind of like bristle at it if we don't understand why these things matter. So I want to just take tonight and I want to lay out a basic outline of the Scriptures. You have the Scriptures there for you. And when we're dealing with this dispensational flow, we're now dealing with God's chronological movement in his relationship with man. And this is simply going to be for the sake of time, a timeline, if you will. This timeline is going to show us God's progressive revelation, how he's revealed himself to man, how he's interacted with man, how he will interact with man in the sense of time. But I also want you to understand time is different from impact, who it's going to impact. So just because, and we'll talk here in just a second, just because God says something here, but then there's going to be something that changes and we move to here, it doesn't mean that there's no impact of this that carries over to this, or maybe to this, or maybe to this. And we're going to see there are some things that are going to carry through from this first interaction with man, between God and man, clear up into this last interaction between God and man. There are some things that are going to carry through it all. And so just because we move forward in God's revelation to man and how he relates in relationship to man doesn't mean that all things are left behind. Some things are going to carry along, and we'll look at that. So when we're looking at time, we're looking in the scope of eternity. So we've got eternity past. And really to talk about eternity past, there's not a lot of point in it. One, if you can wrap your mind around eternity past, good for you. Most of us are too pea-brained to even think about that. Second of all, what was God doing in eternity past? Who was God in eternity past? God knows. So, we just recognize that as from our perspective, time began right here. As we know time, it began at the moment of creation. This is our Genesis 1:1 moment. God spoke in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke, and everything that is became. And so this is just where we're going to start the conversation right here at Genesis 1:1. What was before that, really, there's no dispensational theologian that really cares. Now remember, the covenant theologians will say eternity past, there was a covenant between Christ and God the Father. And so they will go back to eternity past and talk through some covenants that they believe were made back then. But as a dispensational theologian, eternity past, it's eternity past. There's not really a conversation there. So as we come then to creation, God's first creation relationship with man, Ryrie titles this innocency, but normally we just call it innocence. And so in this era, in this dispensation, in this economy of innocence, we read about that here in Genesis 1:3 through 3:6. And ultimately, this is what we knew as paradise. God, in his relationship with man, man was completely innocent before his eyes. He hadn't sinned. There was no barrier between God and man. One of the things that indicates that there was no shame between God and man, or between man and his wife, what was one of those symbols that there was no shame in the relationship? They were naked. Exactly. And so, they were naked. And that nakedness showed that there was nothing to be ashamed of. There was nothing to hide. They were just the way God made them, being who God wanted them to be. And the relationship between God and man was good. Now, Ryrie then breaks out of that covenant, or that dispensation, he breaks out some responsibilities. And in that, the responsibilities of Adam and Eve were to keep the garden, they were to tend the garden, to not eat one fruit. What fruit were they forbidden to eat? Of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Of that tree you shall not eat. Eat anything else. Anything else you find, stick it in your mouth. Man, it's back to toddler stage. You just stick it in, eat it. It's fine. Everything is good for food. Just don't eat of that one tree. And then they were to subdue the earth. Multiply. Be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. I want humanity to encompass the entire globe. And so procreate and have children and subdue the earth. And then to walk with God, to daily fellowship and walk with God. And we know that happened after the fall. It says in Genesis chapter 3, God came to the garden, as was his habit, to fellowship with Adam. But for the first time, Adam did what? He hid. He hid. But in a normal day, in a normal progression, their role was to have fellowship with God. Now, that innocence before God, in perfect harmony with God, in perfect harmony with the creation, there were only two human beings ever who got to experience that. Do you know what their names were? Adam and Eve. That's it. Two people. Nobody else ever experienced it. And so it was a dispensation really just for them. And as they walked in the garden and they tended the garden and they lived in the garden and they were naked before God with no shame, they really understood what we were created to be. Complete harmony, complete peace. And yet, there would be, if they failed to keep God's commandment, to keep God's standard under that economy, under that dispensation, which the only real thing put on them was, don't eat the tree. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you don't do that, then this dispensation will stay just the way it is. You'll continue to multiply, you'll continue to tend the garden, you'll continue to have fellowship with me. But if you don't, there was a judgment, there was a consequence. I prefer the term consequence to judgment, but there would be a consequence of not living under God's economy, under the innocency. And that was curses and death. That's what would come. And we know the rest of the story. And as this age of innocence and this age of nakedness with God and Adam and Eve, here they're tending garden, they're caring for the earth, they're multiplying, having children, and they're fellowshipping with God. This is kind of what they're supposed to be doing under this time. As they break that, and death then comes in, we now are going to have this moment. There's this precise moment in time when there's a big change. And that moment comes the moment Adam bites into that fruit. And God comes to him and says, Adam, I told you that you were not to eat of that tree. Because you ate of that tree, the curses are named. Death now enters the world. Sin enters the world. And so next title for the next era of time as God relates to man, many have titled the era of conscience. The era of conscience. Now, as we come at this pivotal moment, when Adam eats that fruit, he now knows knowledge of good and evil. He knows what it means to sin. And he's ashamed of his sin. And he hides. Adam and Eve make the clothes of fig leaves. And they go and they hide from God because they're ashamed of their sinful state. And so now this moment that Adam eats, Adam has a conscience. I did wrong. I messed up. Got to hide. I've got to hide from God. I got to blame the woman. The woman's got to blame the snake. The snake, well, he just got to eat dirt. But there's this conscience of, I know when I did wrong. And that began in Genesis chapter 3 at the moment that they ate of that tree. And yet, what carried over with them after they sinned? Of the things God had asked them to do in innocence, what things carried over? Were they continuing to tend the earth? Yes, the tending continued. Only now tending with suffering. The tending continues, but the curse is going to affect that. Are they supposed to still multiply? Yes, they're still having children. And so the multiplying continues, but with pain in childbirth and with death now entering the world. Those children are going to die. They're going to battle illness. They're going to battle disease. There's going to be, broken bones and all the stuff that you guys have kids. You know all the stuff that they bring. And so they'll be multiplying with suffering. Parenting ain't going to be a walk in the park. And then what about this fellowship with God? Was this just going to continue? No. They were banned from the garden. They were banned from having that intimate fellowship with God. There was now sin between God and man, and the intimate fellowship was broken, and in its place, now God is wrestling with each individual conscience. Conscience, right and wrong. And so now, rather than having intimate fellowship with God, there's a struggle with right and wrong in their relationship with God. Did everybody lose the battle? At some point, everybody did sin. Did some learn to walk with God through that era? As we read from Genesis 3 through Genesis 8, were there some faithful who walked with God? There were. Some notable names that you know from that era. Who comes to mind? Enoch comes to mind. Good. Noah is going to be one who's found righteous, finds favor in the eyes of God, finds grace in the eyes of the Lord. Good. Anybody else? Abel. Abel is known to be faithful. Seth is indicated to be one who was faithful. And so there are those during this era, of Genesis 3 through Genesis 8 that did walk with the Lord, but in general, what was the heart of man? By the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, always evil continually. And the trend was that wrong dominated over right in the hearts of most humanity. And so they were found unfaithful. And so because of their unfaithfulness, God strove with the conscience of man. Genesis chapter 6, he says, I regret that I've made man. I am tired of wrestling with the conscience of every single human being on the earth. It's this tit for tat, right for wrong. All I want you to do is obey me, but you won't obey me. So I show you grace, and I continue to give you rain. I continue to give you prosperity. And yet, no matter what, your heart is continually on evil, and God was done. He was done with it. And He brought about an event, a consequence for the wickedness of man. What was that event? A global flood. And so right here we have another marker in history. So this is the fall of man into sin. This is the flood. Now, with that flood, everything is going to change again. Did that change the day that God told Noah to build the ark? Did that change the day that the rain fell? Did that change the day that the rain stopped falling? Did that change the day that the dove found the olive branch? Did that change the day that Noah got off the ark? Did that change the day that God made a sacrifice on the altar to the Lord? We can debate that until the cows come home. Okay, this is where I say you can read different dispensationalists of when they think each dispensation ends and begins. And at the end of the day, who cares? Okay? Really, who cares? Because here around, and this is a precise moment of time. This is Adam bit into that thing, whatever it was. And it was sin entered the world. This one, I'm going to just kind of put a circle around it because it's around the time of the flood. Around the time of the flood, God changes the rules. Wait, but God never changes. Did I just speak heresy? In character, He never changes. He is just, but He's also merciful. And yet in His relationship to man, in His relationship through history, God can change the rules because He's God and we are His creation. And so when God says, look, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm sending a flood, I'm destroying the earth, and I'm going to take and begin again with how many people? 8 people. 8 people started it. And that 8 people is going to turn into, we'll just say millions. Because as they come off of this flood, they're going to come into, according to Genesis chapter 9, they're going to come into an area that we call often human government. Why would we title that era human government? Post-flood with Noah, all the way up until something else changes. Why would we use that title, human government? Yeah, Mike? Correct. Yeah, here we've got this, everyone's just doing their own thing. And so God judges that, and as they come into this, the heart hasn't changed. Every man still wants to do what's right in his own eyes, but God said, I'm not wrestling with each person anymore. I'm not going to sit back and judge and look over the shoulder of every single human being and wrestle with their conscience. I'm not doing it. And so He tells Noah in Genesis chapter 9, He says, now you take care of the sin in your own camp. If a man kills a man, you kill him. If there's things that are sinning and bringing harm upon other humanity, other things, you guys hold each other accountable. And so the other thing that we could, because, nobody likes this word government, that's like a swear word in church. So, if we didn't want to use that word government, we could also call this human accountability. You guys hold each other accountable. You guys judge each other. You guys hold each other's feet to the fire and regulate the problems that exist within your camps, within your families, within your communities. And so this idea of human government then was established, that God's now going to let leaders, family heads of clans, kings of nations, however it plays out, and it plays out differently all over the world. If we look at what happens in the middle of the Tower of Babel, and Babel's going to happen right here in the middle of this thing. We're going to have Babel going on, and the nations are dispersed with all their language groups. There's going to be different systems of working out how to hold each other accountable. But wherever you go, whether you're dealing with Eskimo people up in Alaska, dealing with Aborigines down in Australia, dealing with the highest civilizations in Europe, that are highly developed and technical, there is always some system of accountability. If somebody does wrong, there's a way to deal with that. And so that began here in Genesis chapter 9. It began with 8 people. It spread to millions. With that, did the tending go away? No tending went away. They continue to tend with suffering. I'm just going to use suff. Did the multiplying go away? God, in fact, reinforces that. He tells Noah, you and your sons, you get off the ark, be fruitful and multiply. He repeats the same command to Noah that He gave to Adam and Eve. And so the multiplying continues with suffering. That doesn't go away. Did the conscience go away? Within the heart of man to have this concept of right or wrong? No, this right-wrong struggle continues. But now, under this era, from Genesis chapter 9, and, Charles Ryrie is going to put that to around Genesis chapter 11. I would argue with him a little on that, but that's okay. I get why he does it. But now we're adding one more condition. What is that condition? What comes in with that? Go out, be fruitful and multiply, tend to the earth. You still have this conscience of right and wrong, but when people now do wrong, what's the other thing man is required to do? Punish. Punish evil. And so the rules changed. Now there's an accountability between humanity to hold one another. In the eyes of God is the presumption to do what's right. Unfortunately, man began to define their own concept of right and wrong. Because the conscience, whatever we may want to think about it, it's a horrible guide. It was a horrible guide then. It was a horrible guide here, and still continues to be, because the conscience, it's fickle. We read in the New Testament that we can sear our consciences like a hot iron, just making scar tissue. The conscience is really a fickle thing. But the idea of punishing evil, that's going to come over into the concept of human government or civil government. And so then, when that didn't happen, when they weren't holding each other accountable for punishing evil, God did send the Tower of Babel, and that's where Ryrie would say that kind of era ended. One, I don't think it ended at Babel, because each of those civilizations went out, and I think they were still under this same concept that God had given humanity. And I think that's evidenced because every nation, every civilization has some sort of civil authority, some sort of structure for justice that's ingrained into the culture. And so I think Babel, it continues on, and I know it continues to this day. And although we're going to see God begin to work something new over here, I'll put this at Genesis chapter 12 and on, we're going to see something new begin to form, but while that's forming, human government is going to go on. And it still goes on today. And so we're going to have a pivot point here, and I don't believe it's Babel, that takes God into doing something different in the world. What is the next major event that God breaks into history? Yes, Babel, he breaks into history. I totally agree. I don't disagree with Ryrie that that's a pivotal moment in history. But beyond that, after that, what's a big moment where God breaks into history? With Abraham. He makes a covenant with Abraham. And again, I'm going to put a circle around that. Is it when he called Abraham to leave Ur and to go to a land I will show you? Was it when he made a covenant with Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to, in the earth all the people will be blessed. In you all the nations will be blessed. Is it in Genesis 15 when he renews that covenant and the promise of one who's going to come as his descendant? We can argue about that, but really with Abraham, things start changing again. And as Abraham enters the scene and God begins this covenant with Abraham, what we have listed by Ryrie is patriarchal rule. And again, I don't disagree with him. I think that is what's going on. Many of us through the years have called it the era of promise. That God had a promise to Abraham. And that promise to Abraham went to the patriarchs. It's going to go on then as God works this out. He's going to work through Abraham. He's going to work through Isaac. That's a no-brainer. And then he's going to work through... That stumbles a lot of people. Well, why not Esau? Why did God choose Jacob? And why what justice is there in that? That Esau was rejected and Jacob was chosen. And we can get into that another day. It's a really interesting study. But this concept that God is going to work through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then who? The 12. Yeah, we're just going to call it the 12 tribes. The nation of Israel. And through this, God is going to start working a promise. And that promise that he made to Abraham, and that promise that he renewed with Isaac, that promise that he renewed with Jacob, that promise that by Exodus 1, he remembers his promise. That's what Exodus 1 says. And the Lord remembered his promise, and he heard the cry of Israel in the bondage of slavery. And as the Lord remembers this promise, he's now going to begin to work his promise with this 12 tribe, and he's going to bring them out of the land. And that brings us to Exodus 12 through 14. And again, God's going to change things. Now, as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob receive this promise, in that, do they get any passes on any of this? Of any of this civil government era, do they get any, you don't have to do any of that stuff anymore? No, Abraham tends his sheep. Isaac and Jacob, they tend their flocks. Israel becomes a great nation of herdsmen. And so they're still tending, they're still caring, they're still working with suffering. They become slaves, for crying out loud. They're breaking their backs under bondage of suffering to do the work. To multiply, well, that's part of the promise. Part of the promise is, I will make you a great nation. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And so this is going to continue. Are they going to lose their concept of right and wrong in their conscience? Not at all. Each of them is going to continue to wrestle with their conscience. Are all of them going to do what's right in the eyes of the Lord? No. But there's always some that do. There's always a remnant of Israel. And why are they the remnant? Because they get some special blessing or miracle from God that makes them the remnant? No, because some, wrestling in their conscience, are going to bring this right conscience into their relationship with God and the promise. And so some are notable. Some walk with the Lord, even in those days wandering under the promise. And then to punish evil, they're supposed to continue to do that within their own household. They punish evil. And so all of these things carry over, but now what else comes with the condition of the promise? What are they supposed to do? This is where some of the covenants we talked about come in. They have a covenant to land. Dwell in the land that I have given to you. Pastor Cleve? Yes.
They can only do that as they obey.
Correct. And so, again, with this right conscience and punishing evil, then they're to walk in obedience. Now, how are they going to walk in obedience? Under what command? What's that? They don't have it yet. Yeah, they're wandering. Abraham's wandering around with his flocks. Isaac's wandering around with his flocks. Jacob, he's wandering around with his flocks. The 12 tribes, they're wandering around. They end up in Egypt as slaves. What command are they following? Faith in God's promise. Yeah, they're holding on to the faithfulness of the promise. Good. What else?
Seems to be hints of some kind of a law, maybe not written law, but clear back to the conscience.
Yes.
Cain didn't follow the correct way of sacrifice. We don't have it lined out, but there's some semblance of the law that goes back to the conscience.
It does. From the age of innocence of what it looked like to walk with God, to now this conscience of what's right and wrong. There was some sort of a law written in their heart of what was right and wrong. And then they were holding each other accountable to that. It's wrong to kill somebody. It's wrong to beat somebody up and take their oatmeal instead of eating your own oatmeal. You know, we teach our kids these things. Whether you're a Christian or not, whether you believe in the Bible or not, there are things that we inherently know are right or wrong. And through the walk with God and those that cared, those that were paying attention, how did God deal with Cain? How did God deal with Reuben and Simeon and Levi? You know, these ones that through their own history committed some pretty heinous acts, some kind of disgusting stuff that happened in their history. Okay, so that happened. That really happened. These weird, bizarre, incestual things that we're scratching our head saying, these are the people of God, but they're observing. And through holding each other accountable, they begin to hold themselves accountable to this unwritten law of God.
And kind of related to that, if you look back in like Noah's sons, the really like evil tribe or civilizations that came out of them, most of them came from Ham.
The curse, yeah.
Yeah, so the more disobedience, it just gets greater and greater until God eventually uses the children of Israel to destroy them.
Yes, that's right. Disobedience breeds disobedience. Just read Romans 1. It's a perfect picture of what happens when people are not walking with God. And so Romans 1's happening, and these nations are getting further and further from God. And so God pulls a nation to himself. All those nations are getting further from me, and some more heinous than others. Some are just totally corrupt, perverse cultures. And, we could study what happened to the Mayans. To this day, nobody really knows what happens to the Mayans. But what we know is they were a completely perverse, disgusting, warped culture. And they're gone. God dealt with them. But what God also did, as he's dealing with these nations and their corruption, he begins to pull a people to himself. And says, you know what? Y'all aren't getting it. So I am going to do it myself. I'm going to grab Abraham, and with this guy, I am going to build my own nation. Now, at times, God's patience gets tested, and we'll see that throughout the history of Israel. But God is going to do it. And so he's building a nation based on this land and this obedience to an unwritten law, until we come to another pivot point in history. Another guy shows up on the scene. Moses. Moses shows up on the scene. And now we've got Moses, and Moses comes not as a child of promise. God doesn't promise to build anything in Moses. Moses comes as a prophet. And as a prophet, he represents God's word, and he speaks to the people of God. And so as a prophet, he comes, and there is a moment when, at some point in this process of leaving Egypt, coming into the land, some say it happened at Passover, some are going to say it happened at Sinai, others are going to say after Sinai when they built the tabernacle and they inaugurated the tabernacle, and the glory of God, the Shekinah, presence of God, descended and filled the tabernacle. I don't really care. Okay? At some point around the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt and taking them out into the wilderness, somewhere in there, God gave a written law. This is not a law that's written on hearts. This is not a law that's in conscience. This isn't a law that's made up by men, that they will and won't do certain things without being held accountable to each other. This is God himself breaking in, giving law to who? To Israel. To Israel. This is for God's nation. This is for the people that God is calling out to do the fulfillment of his promise. And this promise carries over directly to the written law. So the children of the promise are the receivers of the written law. The written law was never a part of this. Nowhere in the Old Testament are the prophets commanded, take the law and go and preach it to the nations. There are some exceptions where we have Jonah going to Nineveh, preaching to the Assyrians. We're later going to have Nahum go back and preach again to them. Some of the prophets, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, they're going to give prophecies to and about other nations, but there is no command anywhere for the people of Israel to take this law and go preach it to the people all around them. It's not what it was for. It was for them to become the nation God wanted them to be. And so it was written law to Israel, to these children of the promise. And so who does it concern? Just like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes were concerned, it then goes directly to the 12 tribes. That's who it was for. It was given to them to guide them, to make them into the people that God wanted them to be. And with that, would they stop tending in suffering? No, they're going to tend. In that, are they going to stop multiplying? They're going to multiply. In that, are they going to have lost their conscience of right and wrong? They're going to have a conscience. However, because their conscience is warped, they're now going to have a law that's going to supersede their conscience. And so essentially what God's going to tell Israel, I don't really care what your conscience tells you. Do it my way. That's essentially what the law of Moses does. I don't care what your conscience says. You're going to do it my way. And what would be the consequence if they didn't obey the law? If they didn't do it God's way, what would be their consequence? There were. Banishment was the ultimate. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there was multiple consequences. We could look at pestilence. We can look at war. We can look at bondage. Just read the book of Judges. Every time Israel did what was right in their own eyes, they turned from the Lord and they worshipped idols. So God rose up Midian, and Midian came and attacked them. And then they do it all again. And God raised up the Philistines, and the Philistines came and ransacked them. And then God raised up Moab, and Moab came and thrashed them for a little while. And so they have this bondage and this war, and the ultimate suffering, the ultimate consequence they would do was captivity. They would be captive as bond slaves in the lands of Assyria and the land of Babylon. That's the ultimate bondage. That's the ultimate consequence. And by the way, I'm going to just cut off there for tonight, and we'll finish this up later. But because this is where we're at. This is where we're at when now Christ is going to come on the scene. Because ultimately they're going to stay under this law from Moses through all the history of the judges and the kings and the prophets. You know, all the prophets are going to prophesy from the Old Testament through this era. Even John the Baptist, even Jesus Christ is going to be born under this law of Moses. Jesus is going to do his earthly ministry, all the Gospels. All 33 years of his earthly ministry and those red letters that are in our Bible, in the Gospels, all of those messages are going to be preached under the law. And there's going to be an event in history. And this one, again, we're going to have to put a circle around it. There's going to be an event in history that changes everything again. Was it his death on the cross? I would say yes. Others would argue no, it was the day of Pentecost. Others argue no, it was the day of his ascension. Okay, so we're playing with 40 days. And it gets a little weird in there. You know, what happens to somebody who believed in Jesus, but they died before they received the Holy Spirit? You know, we can get into all that stuff. And we will, because it's fun. But yes, Phil.
There was another thought that what happened when they rejected his, the triumphal entry.
Yeah.
After that, his resurrection.
Yes, that changed it. Yeah, the rejection of Christ at the triumphal entry and the refusal of the kingdom he was offering them. So again, we're putting a circle around it. But there at the cross, give or take 40 days, 50 days, everything changed. And so that's where we'll be when I come back. We're going to talk about from this moment of the cross, from Jesus, death on the cross, forward, where that takes us. But with the 12 tribes of Israel, they were living under this law to make them the nation that God wanted them to be the ones to fulfill this promise that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so as they lived that out, they went into captivity as slaves in Assyria, as slaves in Babylon. Ultimately, after this moment, because their rejection of the Messiah, their Savior, the Anointed One, they're going to go into captivity again under the destruction of Rome, and Rome is going to destroy them. And they'll be scattered among the nations until this present day. And by the way, they're not done yet. You know, as we look at what's coming ahead according to the prophetic timelines, Jerusalem's going to get ransacked again one more time, at least. At least one more time. In history, Jerusalem will get ransacked before the Christ will return and they will accept Him as their King and worship Him for the rest of eternity. And so that's kind of what we need to understand. This is Israel. This is where they were. And those who reject Christ, Israel as a nation, this is still where they are. This is where they are. That's why they still have their Orthodox feasts and their Orthodox Jewish branch. And although they're not keeping the sacrifices and they have all these excuses why, this is the law that God gave them as a people to live by if they weren't going to receive Christ as their Savior. And so that's them. Where is the rest of the world? From this point on, they're operating under conscience and human government. This is the Gentiles. All the Gentiles, to this very day, are working under this. Not innocence. Conscience and human government. The promise and the law was given to Israel to fulfill those promises and to make them God's people. And so, we'll have to then show, where does the church come in? And now you've got these Gentiles that are going to come through the cross. These Gentiles are going to come through the cross into the promise. Now my chart gets all messed up because that's what God does, okay? He's amazing. But the Gentiles are going to come through the cross into the promise without the law, and the Jews are going to blow their lid. What do you mean people are going to come into the promise without the law? You're messing up the order of things. Now you understand why Paul had such a tough ministry, particularly to the Jews, saying all these people are coming to the cross. Now they're going to inherit this promise with us, the Jews, who have been these holders of the law. And even those of you that are holding the law without Christ aren't going to get the promise. Yeah, they got a little bit angry. Might have tried to kill him a time or two over it. And that's where the church comes in. And so I just wanted to walk us through the timeline. Someday I'll do a different chart that shows the impact of these dispensations and how that falls across humanity. And that gets weird too, because now you got people getting saved from all the tribes and all the tongues and all the nations. And it gets wild because God is just huge and He has a massive imagination and He can do whatever He wants to do. And He's chosen to take the craziness that happened right here at the fall and all the brokenness and all the sin and all the disobedience of conscience, all the disobedience of not following civil government, all of those who would not live under the promise, those who refused to keep the law, those who kept the law in pride and vanity to just boast of their own works. He's going to take all of this mess, and in the end, in eternity future, He's going to bring about a people that will glorify Christ for all of eternity. All of eternity, there will be a people glorifying Jesus Christ. Only God can do something like that. And so, I hope you're excited about this study. I know there's a lot of trivial stuff. And really, I think the title of this study is what really caught my attention. Why dispensationalism matters. And the question comes in, why does any of this matter? Why are we spending so much time going through a study like this? And I just want to communicate to you, it matters because we need to know who we are. We need to know what our purpose is. We need to know where we're going. And we need to know what message it is that we need to be telling people. Because if we don't understand all of this, then the messages get crossed. And again, we are living in a day where something like this, a chart like this, is deeply offensive and angering to many who call themselves Christians. And, as I read modern articles and journals, the internet is full of podcasts and blogs and Facebook posts and things. And there is this massive push. I read another one today that dispensationalism ruined Christianity across the globe. It ruined it. And we're never going to get it back. We've just ruined Christianity. And I will tell you why when we get to the end of this and we start critiquing it a little bit. And we'll analyze some of those reasons why. But ultimately, there's a huge misunderstanding and there's a huge rejection of our position, of our camp that believes these things to be true, because there's a rejection of this. There's a rejection of this. And that's where our literal grammatic hermeneutic, it sets us apart, because we're just going to see what the Bible says and we're going to believe it. Whereas the lady who was writing an article today, tearing apart dispensationalism, said these very words in her article. She said, the problem with dispensationalists is they believe the writings of Paul. That's their problem. They believe the writings of Paul. Paul was a bigot and he made up everything that he wrote. The real church is found in the Gospels. The real church is found in the Gospels. That was her conclusion. Those Gospels that all happened right here. That's where she advocates that the real church needs to take its teaching from. And so next 2 weeks, we got 2 weeks of events coming up. When I get back, we're going to look at, wait a minute, do those red letters, do they actually talk about the church? Is that who they're addressed to? Is that what they're intended for? Is it within the red letters we find the birth of the church? And so we'll talk about that when I get back. Next week, you guys will not be here. Okay? If you come here, you're going to be, well, maybe not all alone. If a couple of you are here, pray. But if you find yourself here all alone, well, then, still pray. But you're all going over to Butte Baptist Church over in Vail. If you don't know how to get there, see Pastor Walker. He's got the directions. Most of you are capable of plugging it into your phone. It's Butte, B-U-T-T-E, Baptist Church. And the missions conference will be hosted by them next Wednesday night, and it will be a Q&A panel discussion time with both of the missionaries that are involved in our missions conference. So they're going to host us over there. Then next Sunday night, not this Sunday, okay? Let's not have a mom's night out moment. Not this week, but a week from this Sunday, so 10 days from now, we will be hosting Butte Baptist here on Sunday night at 6 p.m. It'll be combined small groups. They're coming over. All our small groups will come. There's going to be a potluck fellowship with the missionaries to just kind of have a get to know them personally kind of time, and to fellowship with the other church and get to know them as well. So it's going to be a little weird for a couple of weeks, but when I get back, then we'll get back on track and we'll pick up our study. With that, we got word today that the Strites twin daughters, some of you got to meet them. They did a special music when they were out with us last time, have come down with pneumonia. And so they are not going to be able to travel. So Christy and their youngest daughter, thank you, Charlotte, are going to go ahead and stay with them, and just Andy and Gabriel are going to come out. So it'll just be Andy and Gabriel coming out for the conference. And we do not still have all of the meals figured out for them yet. So if you are willing to host them for a meal, there's a sign-up sheet. This Sunday, we have double missionaries. Some of you have met the Rankins, who've been serving up at Shiloh Bible Camp. The Rankins have finished up their summer serving up there. They're bringing their motorhome down here, or their truck and trailer, getting some service work done in the valley. They're going to come worship with us on Sunday. And I said, well, unfortunately, Andy's already got the whole service, so we can't really give you time to share, but we can set up a table and we can provide you with lunch. But we don't have anybody signed up for lunch yet. So they have 3 children. So ages 12 and down, I believe. Does that sound right, Walker? I think that's right. 12 and down. So if you would like to host Troy and Melody and the kids for lunch on Sunday, let Pastor Walker know. And then Andy and Gabriel, if you would like to host them for a meal, you can do that on the sign-up sheet. It's up on the board. Anything else for Missions Conference that I missed? Yes. Okay. For the next 2 Sundays with our missionary speakers here, the youth group that meets downstairs and the group that meets out in the wings will be combined out here in the sanctuary to get to let the missionaries share more about their ministry. The small kids that are the 6-year-olds and down will continue to have their class over in the side wing. Okay, I didn't put together a prayer list tonight, but